They say that certain decisions can change a person's life forever, but what if that decision isn't yours? What if the course of your story is sealed without you having any control over it? Emma Carter never thought that her life could change overnight, much less in such a cruel and irreversible way. That morning, as the shy sun illuminated the streets of Madrid, she woke up with the uncomfortable feeling that something was about to happen. Something big. Something that would change everything. But no matter how much she tried to imagine, she could never have predicted that, in a few hours, she would be taken to the altar to marry a man she didn't know, a man who, according to her father, was her only salvation. What would you do if you knew that your fate had already been decided, without your opinion mattering? And how would you react if you discovered that your entire life had been used as a bargaining chip in a dark and ruthless business? For Emma, these questions stopped being mere daydreams and became her cruelest reality. The answer to the first question was simple. You can try to run away, but sooner or later, the truth always catches up with you. And the answer to the second was even worse. When you realize that your life has been traded like an object, you discover that your freedom was never really yours. That was how Emma felt at that moment. A piece on a board she didn't even know she was playing. Before starting this exciting story, subscribe to the channel. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos, and leave a like to support our work. Comment on which city you're watching from. Now get ready for a story full of twists, turns, emotions, and overcoming. Let's get started. The Carter household was quiet that morning, but not in a welcoming way. The air was heavy with something invisible but suffocating. Emma felt as if she were drowning, trapped in a reality she had not chosen and could not escape. Her father, Thomas Carter, a businessman known for his uncontrollable ambition, sat in the large leather chair in his office, twirling a glass of whiskey between his fingers as if it were not too early to drink. His voice was firm and without room for argument. Today is the most important day of your life, Emma. You will do whatever it takes to save our family. He didn't even look her in the eye as he spoke, as if he had long ago decided that his daughter was merely a means to an end. His name was Ethan Montoya. Businessman, a billionaire, the owner of an empire so large that even the name Montoya carried weight among the powerful in Spain. He had a reputation for being ruthless, cold, and calculating, someone who never let feelings interfere with business. And now, Emma belonged to him. The wedding, in fact, was not a celebration, but a contract signed without her having any choice. Her hands trembled as a stylist adjusted her white dress, hugging it to her body as if tying the last strings of her freedom. The reflection in the mirror showed a woman she did not recognize, her lips pale, her eyes empty. Outside, the world went on as normal, but for Emma, this was the last morning of her old life. Emma felt a lump in her throat as the car finally stopped in front of the imposing cathedral. The building was grand, with Gothic towers that seemed to rise to the sky, but to her the place was nothing more than a gilded prison. Camera flashes went off incessantly as important guests arrived. Fake smiles and rehearsed greetings dominated the atmosphere. In the back seat of the car, Emma remained motionless, her cold, clammy hands resting on the delicate fabric of her dress. The driver opened the door, and a moment of hesitation took hold of her. Run. Escape from there. But where to? Her life was no longer her own. Her eyes scanned the crowd, searching for a familiar face, a sign of support. She found nothing, only expectations and empty stares waiting to see her fulfill her role. She took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, feeling the cold wind against her skin. The aisle seemed to stretch for miles, and each step was a crushing weight on her shoulders. The red carpet beneath her feet was like a one-way track, leading her to meet a stranger who, in a few minutes, would be her husband. Ethan Montoya stood at the altar, his posture impeccable, his gaze impenetrable. Tall, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, he looked like a statue carved from marble. His dark eyes, fixed on her, betrayed nothing. Not anger, not desire, not compassion. Only cold analysis, as if he were sizing up a purchased asset. Emma swallowed hard. Why had he accepted her? Why would a man like him agree to a forced marriage? There was something about this story that she still didn't understand. The priest began the ceremony, but Emma could barely process the words. Her body was there, but her mind was floating away. When the decisive moment came, her skin crawled as she heard Ethan's deep voice echo through the church. "I do." Quick, simple, cold, like he was sealing a deal. The entire church seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her answer. Emma's throat felt dry, her hands sweaty, her heart hammering in her chest. A second turned into an eternity. Was running away still a possibility? But then her eyes met her father's, sitting in the front row. His gaze was a clear warning. There was no escape. Taking a deep breath, she closed her eyes for a brief moment, and finally said, "I do." And with those words, she sealed her fate. Applause filled the cathedral, but to Emma the sound was muffled, distant, a blur of voices and faces cheering for what she considered a verdict. Ethan took her hand firmly, sliding the ring onto her finger in a precise, measured manner. His touch was warm, strong, but completely impersonal. When the priest announced, "You may kiss the bride," Emma felt the breath leave her lungs. Ethan leaned in slightly, but instead of kissing her on the lips, he pressed a brief, cool kiss to her cheek. Formality, an empty gesture, no emotion. Then, without a word, he turned to the guests and walked slowly down the aisle, as if this were just another appointment crossed off his calendar. Emma followed him, knowing that her new life began here, and that from now on she belonged to Ethan Montoya. The reception took place in a luxurious ballroom, filled with white flowers, tables decorated with silver cutlery, and waiters circulating with glasses of champagne. To any outside observer, it was the perfect wedding, an impeccable celebration of the union between two influential families. But to Emma, it all seemed like a cruel act. Sitting next to Ethan at the head table, she barely touched her food, silently watching the guests chatting animatedly, as if everything was completely normal. Ethan, on the other hand, was calm, drinking red wine while having polite conversations with businessmen and important figures. He didn't even look at Emma, as if she weren't there. The feeling of invisibility was almost suffocating. After all, she was nothing more than a name on a contract, a seal that validated $1 million agreement between her father and Ethan Montoya. Soft music filled the room, and then it was time for the bride and groom to dance. A murmur of anticipation ran through the room as all eyes turned to Emma and Ethan. He stood up first, extending his hand to her, his expression neutral as always. Emma hesitated for a second, but she had no choice. She stood up and placed her hand in his, feeling the firmness of his touch. Ethan led her to the center of the room, where the couple was supposed to star in that symbolic moment of connection and intimacy. But there was no connection there. As they danced, Emma kept her eyes fixed on a distant point, trying to ignore the forced proximity. "You look like a statue," Ethan commented softly, his voice low and loaded with something she couldn't identify. Emma pressed her lips together, not responding. To him, this marriage was just a contract, but to her, it was a prison, and no matter what she said or did, she couldn't change that. The dance ended, and Ethan soon released her with the same impersonality as always. The rest of the evening passed in a blur for Emma. Formal conversations, empty speeches, rehearsed smiles. Her mind wandered far away, trying to understand who this man at her side really was. Why had he agreed to this marriage? What did he gain from it? Ethan didn't seem to need political alliances. He was already a powerful tycoon. He didn't need Thomas Carter's influence. So what was behind this? Every detail of the situation seemed carefully calculated, as if there was a missing piece of the puzzle. But no matter how hard she tried to understand, Emma couldn't find answers. All she knew was that in a few hours she would be alone with him, in his house, and she had no idea what to expect from this new reality. When the party finally came to an end, Emma was led into the car next to Ethan. The driver sped smoothly through the nighttime streets of Madrid, and the silence inside the car was heavy, almost suffocating. Emma watched the city pass by through the window, her chest tightening as if she were leaving behind her last chance at freedom. Then, for the first time that night, Ethan spoke directly to her. "You don't have to pretend, Emma," he said, his voice firm but not hostile. "I know you didn't want this, but there's no going back now. So learn to deal with it the best way you can." Emma turned to face him, surprised by his frankness. There was something in the way he spoke, as if he were also dealing with his own inner issues. But before she could respond, the car stopped. They had arrived. And in that moment, Emma realized that the real challenge was just beginning. Emma stepped out of the car hesitantly, feeling the cool night air against her skin. Before her stood the imposing gates of the Montoya mansion, a luxurious and intimidating building surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens and illuminated by soft lights that reflected on the stone facade. Ethan led the way, not looking back, walking with firm steps towards the main entrance. Emma took a deep breath before following him, feeling a shiver run down her spine as she realized that she was actually entering this house. The house of the man she had married but whom she had never met. The door was opened by one of the servants who greeted them, formally before disappearing discreetly into the mansion. The silence in the room was almost absolute, broken only by the sound of Emma's heels echoing on the polished marble floor. As they entered, Ethan finally stopped and turned to her, crossing his arms and studying her for a moment. "You can make yourself at home. This house is yours now, too," he said, but his words sounded empty, mechanical, without any trace of welcome. Emma looked around, taking in every detail of the space where, from that moment on, she would live. The environment was sophisticated, with neutral tones, minimalist furniture, and impeccable organization. Nothing there indicated that this house had a soul or history. It seemed more like a place of passage than a home. Emma felt a knot in her stomach. She didn't belong there. "And what do you expect from me?" she asked, her voice coming out firmer than she expected. Ethan arched an eyebrow slightly, surprised by the direct question. "Nothing." He paused, his expression serious and calculating. "You are my wife on paper, but you don't need to pretend anything beyond that. Just fulfill your social role and don't cause me any problems. That's all I expect from you." There was a sharp edge to his words, but somehow Emma felt relieved. If Ethan didn't demand anything more than formality, it meant he wouldn't try to force her into a real marriage. Still, the feeling of being just a name on a contract was no less distressing. She swallowed hard and nodded, slowly. "Understood." Ethan continued to watch her for a few more seconds, as if trying to read something about her, but then he looked away, taking off his jacket and loosening his tie with a quick gesture. "Your room is down the hall on the left. Mine is across the way," he said before walking away, ending the conversation abruptly. Emma stood still for a moment, absorbing the weight of that reality. Her heart was beating fast, not from fear but from the absolute uncertainty of what the future held. Slowly climbing the stairs, Emma found her room exactly as she had expected. Spacious, luxurious, and impeccably decorated, but impersonal. It was a beautiful space, but empty, with nothing to indicate that anyone actually lived there. She sat on the edge of the enormous bed, feeling the weight of her dress and the entire day pressing down on her shoulders. Outside, Madrid was still alive, the lights shining like tiny diamonds against the night sky. For a moment, she imagined what her life would have been like if everything had been different, if she had had a choice. But there was no more room for what-ifs. Reality was immutable. She was now Emma Montoya, wife of a man who didn't really want her, living in a house that didn't feel like her own. With a deep sigh, she closed her eyes for a moment, trying to calm the turmoil inside her. This would be the first night of many, and from now on, she would need to find a way to survive in this new life. Emma woke up to sunlight streaming into the room through the half-open curtains. For a moment, she forgot where she was, but as soon as she opened her eyes and saw the luxurious surroundings around her, reality crashed down on her like an avalanche. None of this was a dream. She was in the Montoya mansion, married to a man who barely looked her in the eye, living a life she didn't choose. She sat up slowly in bed, her body feeling heavy from the emotional exhaustion of the night before. She was still wearing a silk robe that had been left on the armchair, but her wedding dress, that symbol of everything she had lost, was still there, hanging in the corner of the room, like a cruel reminder of her new reality. Taking a deep breath, Emma decided that if she wanted to maintain any semblance of sanity, she needed to start understanding the rules of this game. After showering and changing into something comfortable, she quietly went downstairs to find the house enveloped in an eerie stillness. The breakfast table was already set in the dining room, but Ethan was not there. Did that surprise her? Not at all. One of the servants appeared quickly, greeting her formally and informing her that her husband had already left for an early morning meeting. Emma nodded, feeling an inexplicable relief. It meant that, at least for today, she would not have to deal with him. She sat down at the table, reaching for a cup of coffee, but her appetite was not coming. Her mind revolved around a single question. What was really behind this marriage? She knew that her father had financial interests and that Ethan had somehow agreed to this arrangement. But what exactly did he gain from it? Emma knew she wouldn't get any answers while she stood there waiting. So, after breakfast, she decided to explore the mansion. She walked through the spacious, cold hallways, taking in the details of that impeccable but lifeless house. Ethan's office caught her eye. The door was ajar, and on impulse she entered. The space was austere, decorated with dark wood furniture, shelves full of books, and a huge glass desk that was impeccably organized. It was a space that perfectly reflected the man it belonged to. Calculated, impeccable, and with no room for error. Emma ran her fingers through the books, trying to find anything that would give her a clue about Ethan Montoya. It was then that she saw a discreet photo frame in the corner of the bookcase. She approached it, picking it up carefully. The photo showed Ethan as a young man, next to an elegant-looking woman. The expression on his face was different from the one she knew now. There was a shadow of pain in his eyes. Who was that woman? And why had Ethan hidden that photo there, away from the eyes of any visitor? The sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway made Emma jump. Her heart raced. Ethan was back. Quickly, she put the photo back in its place and left the office, closing the door quietly behind her. She walked quickly to the garden, as if she had been there for some time trying to appear carefree, but inside her heart was pounding. There was something in Ethan Montoya's past that he didn't want anyone to find out. And now, more than ever, Emma was determined to understand what secrets were hidden behind that cold, mysterious man. The sound of footsteps was approaching, steady and rhythmic, and Emma knew immediately that it was Ethan. He walked with the kind of person who was always in control, always one step ahead. He kept his back to her, pretending to gaze at the flowers in the garden while he tried to calm his rapid breathing. "Are you comfortable in the house yet, Emma?" His voice came from behind her, low and filled with a dangerous neutrality, the kind of tone that hid more than it revealed. Emma turned slowly, meeting his eyes for the first time that morning. There was something different there, a tension, a weight that hadn't been there the night before. "Little by little," she said, keeping her tone steady. She didn't want to appear fragile in front of him. Ethan narrowed his eyes slightly, as if trying to read every detail of her expression. "Good. I hope you get used to it soon. This is your life now." She felt a shiver run down her spine. "This is your life now." There was something unsettling about that sentence. Emma crossed her arms, tilting her head slightly to the side. "You left early," she said, trying to keep the conversation light, but at the same time trying to understand his routine. "Business," he answered automatically, as if that would be enough to end the subject. But Emma noticed that his posture had stiffened a little, as if he were deliberately keeping his distance from her. And he was. It was as if the less he got involved, the safer he would be. But safer from what? Emma needed to find out. "Did you always want to get married, Ethan?" The question slipped out before she could think. For a second, he looked surprised. Then, a small, almost ironic smile curved his lips. "Wanting has nothing to do with it, Emma. Some things just happen. Some things just happen." But that wasn't true. Nothing in Ethan Montoya's life seemed to be a coincidence. Everything was calculated, planned, executed with precision. Their marriage was no exception. So why had he agreed to this? What was the real reason behind this decision? Emma wanted to ask, wanted to press him until he got the truth, but she knew he wouldn't give anything away easily. Instead, she decided to play it safe. "I hope that whatever the reason, we can at least be civil to each other," she said, choosing her words carefully. Ethan watched her for a moment, and Emma saw something flash in his eyes, a spark of something he quickly suppressed. "Civilization is a good start," he replied before slowly walking away, leaving Emma standing alone in the garden. But she knew this game was only just beginning. When she walked back into the house, she felt different. Something had changed inside her. She couldn't just accept her fate. If Ethan Montoya was keeping secrets, she would find out. If he believed he could keep everything under control, Emma would make sure to prove him wrong. She wasn't an immovable piece on this board. And from that moment on, she would start playing. Emma spent the rest of the day exploring the mansion. Every room was immaculate but cold, with no signs of life. No photos, no personal items. Nothing to suggest that anyone actually lived there. Everything seemed carefully planned, so as not to reveal anything about Ethan Montoya. This only increased her suspicions. Who was he besides the powerful man everyone knew? What was he hiding behind that impeccable facade? Emma realized that finding out would be essential to surviving this marriage. She couldn't just be a spectator. She needed to understand the rules of the game. Late in the afternoon, she heard a car pull up to the entrance. Ethan was back. Emma stood in the hallway, watching him enter, his features as serious as ever. He walked past her without saying a word. Emma followed him with her eyes until she saw him disappear into the office, the same office where she had found the mysterious photo. For a moment, she thought about confronting him about it, but she knew it would be useless. Ethan would only talk when he wanted to, and so far everything indicated that he didn't want to. Later at dinner, the silence between them was awkward. Emma didn't want to be the first to speak, but the tension in the room was suffocating. Ethan cut his food with precision, his eyes fixed on his plate. She decided to break the silence. "How was your day?" she asked, trying to sound nonchalant. He looked up, surprised by the question. Like everyone else, the short answer didn't surprise her. Emma could tell that Ethan was a man used to keeping his distance. But why? She didn't press the issue. Instead, she watched him silently, trying to figure him out. Ethan was a mystery, but Emma knew that sooner or later she would find a way through. He might be closed off, but no one was impenetrable. She didn't plan on being just the silent wife he wanted. If Ethan Montoya was hiding secrets, she would make sure to find them. But to do that, she would have to be smart, and most of all, patient. That night, Emma had trouble sleeping. Her body was exhausted, but her mind was working nonstop. There was something about Ethan Montoya that made her uneasy. He didn't just seem distant, but trapped, as if there was something preventing him from getting close. What could it be? Emma turned over in bed, staring at the dark ceiling. If she wanted to understand Ethan, she needed to observe him more closely, find out how his mind worked, and, most importantly, what he was hiding. The next morning, Ethan had already left when Emma came downstairs. Another day without answers. She took the opportunity to walk around the property, taking in every detail. The mansion was surrounded by security, as if something needed to be protected or hidden. Why so much secrecy? Emma sat in the garden, observing the house. What was inside that she didn't already know? His answer came faster than he had imagined. When he went back inside, he found a door half open in the second-floor hallway. He was sure it had been locked before. His heart raced. As he approached, he realized it was a room, but not just any room. In the center, there was an armchair, books scattered around, and photos. Photos of a woman, the same one from the picture in the office. Before she could react, she felt a presence behind her. Her body froze. "You shouldn't be here." Ethan's voice was low, but it held something different. Emma turned slowly and met his intense gaze. This time, he didn't just look angry. He looked hurt. She had just touched on something he didn't want anyone to find out about. Emma held Ethan's gaze, trying to read his expression. There was something there she'd never seen before. It wasn't anger or coldness, it was pain. For a moment, she almost felt guilty for invading his space. But then she remembered. Didn't he owe her an explanation? "Who is she?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he ran a hand over his face as if trying to control something inside him. "This isn't your business," he said dryly. Emma crossed her arms, refusing to accept that answer. "I'm your wife, Ethan, even if it's only on paper." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Exactly, on paper." His tone was sharp, but Emma didn't back down. If he thought he could push her away with vague answers, he was mistaken. "If it doesn't matter, why are you hiding it?" This time, Ethan looked at her differently, as if he was considering how much he could trust her. The silence between them grew heavy. Then finally, Ethan sighed, sounding defeated. "Her name was Camilla. His tone was low, almost a whisper. Emma held her breath. It wasn't a complete answer, but it was a start. Her name? She repeated, trying to grasp the weight of those words. Ethan looked away, as if reliving something he'd rather forget. She died. That was all he said. Emma felt a tightness in her chest. Now everything made sense. The coldness, the distance, the silence. Ethan Montoya was broken. He hadn't accepted this marriage because he wanted it. He had accepted it because he couldn't allow himself to feel anything else. Emma realized in that moment that her biggest challenge wouldn't be facing him. It would be making him see that there was still something left to fight for. Ethan looked away, as if he'd said more than he'd meant to. Emma could tell that the name carried an immeasurable weight for him. "I'm sorry," he said softly, and for once it wasn't out of obligation. It was sincere. He let out a long sigh, running a hand through his hair. "You don't have to be. It doesn't change anything." His voice was cold, but different from before. It wasn't indifference. It was protective, like he didn't want to allow himself to feel anything. Emma knew there was no point in pushing him any further. If she wanted to understand Ethan, she would have to wait for him to trust her. And trust was not demanded. It was earned. She took one last look around the room before leaving him alone with his memories. As she walked down the hallway, she felt something inside her change. Before, she had only wanted to understand Ethan Montoya. Now, she wanted something more. She wanted to help him. That night, as they ate dinner in silence, Emma felt his presence differently. Ethan seemed more distant than ever. His shoulders were tense, his gaze lost in space. It was as if, by talking about Camilla, he had opened a wound that he had spent years trying to bury. "Have you ever loved anyone, Emma?" The question came out of nowhere, taking her by surprise. She blinked a few times before answering. "I don't know if what I experienced can be called love." Ethan nodded, as if he understood. There was something in his eyes that Emma had never seen before. Vulnerability. She knew, in that instant, that there was something broken inside him, and that no matter how much he tried to hide it, Ethan Montoya was as lost as she was. After that night, something changed between them. The silence was no longer so suffocating. Even without many words, Emma could feel that Ethan was starting to let his guard down, albeit slowly. He no longer treated her with the same distant coldness. His glances lingered a little longer, his gestures seemed less automatic. But there was a long way to go before he truly trusted her. Emma knew that. And strangely, she was willing to wait. One morning, as she sat drinking coffee on the porch, she heard footsteps behind her. Ethan stood beside her, surveying the landscape. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then he broke the silence. "I used to come here with her." His voice was low, as if he were testing her own endurance. Emma remained quiet, waiting for him to continue. "Camilla loved this place." The words came out with difficulty, but they were there. It was a beginning. Emma turned slightly to face him. What happened to her? Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. When he opened them, his gaze was filled with something dark. "She died because of me." The confession came raw, without beating around the bush. Emma's heart raced. There was so much more to this story than he was telling. "What do you mean?" Ethan clenched his fists, looking away. "I don't want to talk about it." She could insist, but she knew it would be useless. Ethan would talk when he was ready. But in that moment, Emma realized something important. His past wasn't just painful. It was a scar he refused to let heal. And perhaps, without realizing it, he was waiting for someone to help him close that wound. For the next few days, Ethan avoided the subject. Emma knew she had touched on something sensitive, but she also knew he couldn't avoid it forever. Little by little, she began to notice patterns in his behavior. Ethan would spend hours at the office, leaving early and returning late. When he was home, he would keep himself busy all the time, as if trying to avoid his own silence. Emma saw this for what it was, an escape. He would hide away in his work to avoid facing what was haunting him. One night, Emma woke up with a start to a noise coming from the hallway. When she left the room, she found Ethan standing in front of the door to Camilla's old room. His hand was on the doorknob, but he didn't seem able to turn it. His body was tense, as if he was fighting something inside him. Emma hesitated for a second before approaching. "Ethan," He closed his eyes at the sound of her voice, but he didn't turn around. "Go back to your room, Emma." She could have obeyed, but she didn't. She stepped closer, standing beside him. "You don't have to face this alone." Ethan let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Do you think you can fix what's broken?" Emma swallowed hard, but kept her gaze steady. "Maybe not, but running away from it won't change anything." For the first time, Ethan looked her straight in the eyes. There was something there that Emma had never seen before. It wasn't anger, it was fear. After a long silence, he took his hand off the doorknob and turned to leave. But before he left, he said something that made Emma's heart race. "Don't try to save, me, Emma." And then he disappeared into the dark hallway. Emma stood there, feeling the weight of his words. But contrary to what he wanted, it didn't push her away. It only confirmed what she already knew. Ethan Montoya was drowning in his own past. And like it or not, Emma wasn't going to let him sink there alone. Over the next few days, Emma noticed that Ethan was putting up his walls again. He spoke less, spent more time outside, and avoided being around her. It was as if the night in the hallway had never happened, but Emma knew better. He was trying to distance himself because, for the first time, someone was seeing through his facade, and that scared him. She didn't insist, she didn't pressure him, but she was always there, waiting for him to decide to let his guard down again. Then it happened. One night at dinner, Ethan broke the silence. "I never wanted to get married again." The confession came without warning, without context. Emma looked up, surprised that he was willing to talk. Ethan twirled his wine glass in his hands, not looking at her. "After Camilla, I thought I could never feel anything for anyone again." He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "And for a long time I didn't." Emma held her breath. He was opening up, even if it was slowly. "But now?" she asked softly. Ethan finally looked at her, his dark eyes filled with something she couldn't quite identify. "I don't know now." Those words, so simple, carried an immense weight. Emma felt something shift between them in that moment. This wasn't just a forced marriage. Not anymore. The silence stretched on, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of meaning, of possibility. Ethan looked away, raising his glass to his lips. Emma could tell he was struggling with something inside himself, and even without saying anything else, she knew. He was starting to feel something again, and that scared him more than anything else. From that night on, Ethan began to act differently. He still kept his distance, but not in the same way. His glances at Emma lingered longer. His occasional touches seemed less calculated. He no longer treated her like a stranger, but he also didn't move forward. It was as if he were caught between two worlds, the past that haunted him, and the present that confused him. And Emma knew that as much as she wanted to help him, Ethan would have to take the next step alone. Then something unexpected happened. One night, a storm hit Madrid. Lightning streaked across the sky, thunder echoed across the city. Emma couldn't sleep. She went to the living room, hoping a cup of tea would help calm her mind. But when she got there, she found Ethan in front of the fireplace, staring into the flames with a distant expression. He seemed lost in his own thoughts, holding a glass of whiskey he hadn't even drunk. Emma hesitated but decided to approach him. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. Ethan let out a low, humorless laugh. "That's a dangerous question, Emma." She sat down beside him, not flinching. "Why?" He was silent for a long moment. Then he looked away from the flames and looked at her. "Because if I answer truthfully, you might not like the answer." Emma felt a shiver run down her spine, but she didn't look away. "Try." Ethan sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. He looked tired, but not just physically. "I've spent years trying not to feel anything," he confessed. "And for the first time in a long time, I'm not sure I'm succeeding anymore." Emma felt her heart race. There was something different about this moment, something intense. And for the first time, she saw in his eyes not just pain, but desire. The silence between them grew thick, filled with something Emma couldn't quite define. Ethan watched her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. There was no more distance, no more walls between them. For the first time, he was there, without the mask he'd used to keep her away. "And what do you feel now?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Ethan clenched his jaw as if he were fighting with himself. Then without warning he leaned in slightly, closing the distance between them. Emma's heart was hammering in her chest. Should she back away? Say something? But she couldn't, because in that moment there was no doubt what was happening. Ethan touched her face gently, his fingers warm against her cool skin. "I shouldn't want this," he murmured, his voice husky. Emma caught her breath. "But you do." Ethan didn't answer with words. Instead, his lips met hers, hot, urgent, as if he were breaking every rule he'd ever imposed on himself. The kiss was intense, but hesitant at the same time, as if Ethan wasn't sure if he should give in completely. But when Emma slid her fingers around the back of his neck, pulling him slightly closer, he gave in. His hands held hers tightly, as if he was finally accepting what he was feeling. It was a brief moment, but it was overwhelming. When he pulled away, his breath was ragged. "This changes everything," he whispered. Emma knew he wasn't just talking about the kiss. He was talking about what came next. And deep down, Emma knew he was right. From that moment on, nothing between them would be the same. There was no more room to ignore what they were feeling. Ethan Montoya was no longer just a man trying to escape the past. He was someone who, for the first time in years, was ready to feel again. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. Ethan's kiss was still burned into her mind, every detail etched into her skin. It wasn't just his touch, but everything that had been behind that moment. The hesitation, the desire, the internal struggle he was waging. Ethan Montoya wasn't an easy man, and Emma knew it. But for the first time, he had stopped running. Now the question was whether he was ready to move on, or if it had just been a lapse in emotion. The next morning, Ethan was already in the living room when Emma came downstairs. He seemed calm, as if nothing had happened. But she noticed the details, the fingers drumming against the coffee cup, the gaze that had been avoiding hers for too long. He was as restless as she was. Emma hesitated for a moment before moving closer. "About last night," she began, but he cut her off. It was a mistake. The words were a sharp blow, and for a second Emma's chest tightened. She crossed her arms, her posture firm. "A mistake? Is that what it meant to you?" Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. "I can't give you what you want, Emma." His voice wasn't cold, but it carried a different weight. He didn't want to push her away, but he felt like he had to. "And what do I want?" she challenged. Ethan finally looked at her, and his gaze was filled with conflict. Something real. Silence stretched between them. Emma knew she could just accept it and pretend it hadn't happened. But that wasn't possible anymore. The problem wasn't that Ethan didn't feel anything for her. The problem was that he did, and he was terrified of it. "You can keep running away, Ethan," she said, her voice firm. "But I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen." And then, without another word, Emma turned and left the room. This time, she was the one making the rules. Ethan spent the rest of the day holed up in his office. Emma knew her words had gotten to him, but she hadn't expected him to react so immediately. He was a man used to control, to keeping his emotions buried, and now for the first time in years, he was being forced to face his feelings. Emma didn't want to push him, but she couldn't just ignore what had happened either. Something between them had changed, and pretending it didn't mean anything was a lie. The next day, Ethan acted as if nothing had happened. He went about his usual routine, went to meetings, came back late. But Emma could see the signs. The way his eyes followed her when he thought she wasn't looking, the tension in his shoulders. Whenever they were in the same room, he was running away, yes, but not from her. He was running away from himself. And this time, Emma wasn't going to let him hide forever. That night, she decided to confront him. She waited for him to come back, and when Ethan walked into the house, she was sitting in the living room waiting for him. "Can we talk?" she asked bluntly. Ethan hesitated for a second before sighing and sitting down next to her. "Emma, this isn't a good idea." But there was something in his voice that made her realize he wasn't trying to push her away because he didn't want to. He was trying to protect her. "Why do you think you can't feel something for me?" She was blunt. Ethan ran a hand over his face, exhausted. "Because everything I love ends up being destroyed." The words were spoken in a whisper, but they carried a deep pain. And that's when Emma realized. Ethan Montoya wasn't afraid to love her. He was afraid of losing her. Emma's chest tightened at the words. Ethan wasn't just trying to push her away. He was protecting himself from something much bigger. But she didn't want to be protected from something she didn't even understand. You think you can control everything, Ethan, even how you feel. He laughed, but without humor. I need to control. His eyes were filled with something dark. Because when I lost Camilla, I realized that love means nothing when you can't stop the worst from happening. Emma didn't look away. She understood his pain, but she couldn't accept that he would shut himself away forever. You blame yourself, don't you? Her voice was quiet but full of certainty. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, exhausted. Every day. The silence between them grew heavy. He'd never said that to anyone before. Emma knew she was treading on dangerous territory, but if she wanted to make him see that he wasn't doomed to live in the past, she had to see it through. She reached out and touched his hand. Ethan didn't pull away. You think that if you don't feel anything, you'll never hurt again. He didn't answer, but the look in his eyes said it all. But the truth is, Ethan, you're already hurting. You're just alone. His body tensed, as if her words were a punch to the gut. Emma hadn't meant to force him to do anything, but she wanted him to know that running away from his feelings wouldn't make him stronger. And then, to her surprise, Ethan took her hand back. It was a simple gesture, but it was loaded with meaning. He said nothing, promised nothing, but for the first time he wasn't running away. Emma knew in that moment that a barrier had been broken, and that even though he was still resisting, part of him had already begun to allow himself to feel again. In the days that followed, something changed between them. Ethan no longer avoided Emma. There were no promises, no declarations, but the distance he had tried so hard to maintain had dissolved. Their glances lingered longer. The silences were no longer uncomfortable. Emma knew he was still fighting his own heart, but she also knew that a part of him had given in. And this time, he no longer seemed so desperate to escape. One night, as they stood on the porch, Ethan watched her in silence. The wind ruffled his hair, and for a moment he just stood there, taking in the moment. "You didn't give up on me," he said, his voice thick with something Emma had never heard before. She turned to him, surprised by his words. "I never thought of that," she said simply, and it was true. As hard as it had been, she had never wanted to give up on him. Ethan stepped closer, his eyes locked on hers. "Emma, I don't know how to do this." His voice was a whisper, full of uncertainty. She understood. He didn't know how to love again, how to let himself feel without fear of loss. "So we learn together," he said softly, touching her hand. And for the first time, Ethan didn't flinch. He cupped her face gently, as if finally accepting what had been in front of him all along. Then, without hesitation, he kissed her. This time there was no fear, no barriers, just the surrender of a man who, after so long, had finally allowed himself to feel again. The kiss was different from the first time. There was no hesitation, only acceptance. Ethan held Emma as if he had finally found something he didn't want to lose, and she kissed him back with the same intensity. When they pulled away, their faces were still close, their breathing uneven. Emma saw something new in his eyes, hope, and she knew in that moment that nothing would ever be the same again. In the days that followed, Ethan no longer tried to hide his feelings. He was still reserved, but he no longer avoided her presence. Small gestures began to appear. A subtle touch on her hand, a lingering look, a small smile. Emma could tell he was trying, and that was enough. The man who had previously closed himself off from the world now allowed himself to open up to her. One night, as they stood together on the terrace, Ethan took her hand and laced his fingers through hers. "You've changed everything, Emma," he said softly. She smiled softly. "I just showed you what was already there." Ethan pulled her close, hugging her tightly, and for the first time he didn't seem to carry the weight of the past alone. They knew there would still be challenges, that the road ahead would not be easy. But tonight, it didn't matter, because for the first time, Ethan Montoya had put the past behind him, and with Emma by his side, he was finally ready to truly live. Time passed, and what once seemed impossible became real. Ethan and Emma were no longer two strangers trapped in a forced marriage. They had built something real, something that no contract could define. Ethan was no longer afraid to show his feelings, and Emma knew she had accomplished the impossible, made him believe in love again. One evening, as they were walking through the house together, Ethan suddenly stopped. "I want to show you something," he said, taking her hand. Emma followed him into the study where he took out a small envelope and handed it to her. "What is this?" she asked, confused. He smiled softly. "My way of proving to you that I choose to be with you now. Not because I have to, but because I want to." Emma opened the envelope and saw the marriage contract papers, but this time there was something different. In the bottom corner was a signature. His. He had nullified the agreement that had bound them together in the first place. Emma was free now. Her heart raced, but she knew the answer before she could speak. "Ethan," she began, but he cut her off. "You don't have to stay, but I hope you choose to." Emma looked at him, and in that moment she knew there was no more doubt. She wasn't here because she had to be. She never had been. She was here because she loved him. She smiled, holding his hand tightly. "I choose you, Ethan." He smiled back, and for the first time, there was no shadow. His eyes. Only love. Ethan pulled Emma into a tight hug, as if he were absorbing the weight of her choice. This time there was no more fear, no more doubt. He knew Emma was here because she wanted to be, and that meant more than any contract. She wasn't just his wife on paper. She was the woman he chose to love every day. The days that followed were different. The mansion no longer seemed so cold. The silence no longer so lonely. Emma and Ethan had built something that no one could take away from them. The love that arose from pain, from struggle, from resistance. They had overcome their fears, left the past behind, and found in each other the courage to move forward. Together. Years later, as they watched the sunset from the terrace of their home, Ethan took Emma's hand and kissed it softly. "If anyone had told me that I would ever be happy again, I wouldn't have believed them," he confessed. Emma smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "Happiness was always there, Ethan. You just had to let yourself feel it again." And he allowed himself, because in the end it was not destiny that had chosen this love. They were, and that choice, above all else, was the one that truly changed their lives forever. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave a like on the videos. Your support allows us to keep sharing impactful and emotional stories. Thank you for being a part of this community.